After her parents died, Emily Dawson watched her brothers inherit everything: the family business, the family home, and a lifetime of wealth. She inherited an abandoned inn on a forgotten island no one wanted. 4 days after the funeral, she packed a single suitcase and left, believing her parents had given her the worst part of the inheritance. Even her brothers laughed. What none of them knew was that a locked secret had been waiting inside that old inn for more than 60 years. And if Emily had walked away, it would have been lost forever. What she discovered there would change everything she thought she knew about her family, her parents, and the true meaning of inheritance. Emily Dawson buried both of her parents in the same week. She was 22, heartbroken, and 4 days later, her own brothers would tell her the family home wasn't hers anymore. The silence after the funeral was unbearable. The old house on the Maine coast had always been full of life. The smell of cinnamon tea, her father's laughter, her mother's soft humming in the kitchen. Now it was just quiet. The kind of quiet that reminds you someone is missing. Emily stood in the hallway, staring at the marks on the wall where her father used to measure her height. Age 8, age 12, age 17. Then nothing. Because somewhere along the way, her life stopped being about growing up and became about taking care of the people she loved. For 6 years, Emily had stayed home. When her mother got sick, she left college. When her father's cancer returned, she stayed. She cooked meals, changed sheets, and sat beside hospital beds through endless nights. She never complained, because she believed family remembered those things. But grief has a strange way of revealing people. The day after the funeral, William sat in their father's study reviewing financial papers. Jacob walked through the house taking pictures of antiques. Neither asked Emily how she was doing. Neither asked what she wanted. It was as if she had become invisible. That night, William found her sitting alone on the porch overlooking the ocean. "We were meeting with the attorney tomorrow," he said. Emily nodded. Then William added, "You don't need to worry. We'll handle everything. We'll..." Emily looked at him and suddenly understood. Her brothers weren't asking her opinion. They had already decided her future, just like they always had. Later, she sat in her mother's bedroom, holding her father's reading glasses against her chest. For years, Emily had been terrified of losing her parents. What she never imagined was that losing them would hurt less than realizing she had already lost her family. Outside, waves crashed against the cliffs. Far beyond the horizon, hidden by fog and forgotten by time, stood an old island. And on that island, an abandoned inn, its windows dark, its halls silent, and behind one locked door, untouched for more than 60 years, waited the greatest secret her family had ever kept, a secret meant for Emily, and only Emily. The attorney's office smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish. Emily remembered coming here once as a child with her father. She had sat in the waiting room eating peppermints while her parents discussed things adults never explained. Back then, this place felt important. Today, it felt cold. The rain tapped softly against the windows as Emily sat at the far end of the long conference table. She folded her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. Across from her, William looked composed, dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than Emily had in her bank account. Jacob leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone, looking bored, as if he were waiting for a meeting to end. Not the final wishes of the people who had raised him. The attorney, Mr. Whitaker, adjusted his glasses and opened the file. He was an older man with silver hair and kind eyes. Today, even he looked uneasy. "Your parents updated their will 3 years ago," he began softly. Emily nodded. 3 years ago. That was when her father's cancer returned. 3 years ago, while Emily was driving them to appointments and sleeping in hospital chairs, her parents had quietly decided how their story would end. Mr. Whitaker continued, to my eldest son, William Dawson. William straightened. I leave all ownership shares in Dawson Maritime. A small smile crossed William's face. Of course. The company had always been his. The attorney turned the page. To my son, Jacob Dawson. Jacob finally put his phone away. I leave the family home on Bay Cliff Road, including all adjoining properties and investment accounts. Jacob grinned. Told you, he muttered under his breath. William gave him a warning look, but neither of them looked surprised. Emily sat quietly. The house, gone, not sold, not shared, gone. She had known this moment would hurt. She just hadn't expected it to feel so final. Mr. Whitaker cleared his throat. Then his expression changed, almost as if he wished he didn't have to read the next part. To my beloved daughter, Emily. The room grew strangely quiet. Emily lifted her eyes. Mr. Whitaker looked directly at her. I leave full ownership of Silver Moon Inn, located on Whispering Isle, including all structures and surrounding grounds belonging to the property. Silence. A heartbeat. 2. Then Jacob laughed. Actually laughed. You're kidding. William frowned. Silver Moon Inn? Mr. Whitaker nodded. The property has been in your mother's family for generations. Jacob shook his head. That old place. He looked at Emily. Do you even know where it is? Emily swallowed. She did. Barely. When she was little, her mother used to tell stories about an island hidden in fog, an old inn beside the sea, a place where lonely people found peace. Emily had always thought they were fairy tales. That place is falling apart, Jacob said. Nobody's lived there in years. William folded his arms. There must be some mistake. There isn't, Mr. Whitaker replied. The deed is very clear. Jacob scoffed. So she gets an abandoned hotel and we get everything else. Mr. Whitaker didn't answer. But Emily noticed something strange. The attorney's fingers lingered on the final page, as if there was something more. He slid a small envelope across the table. Its edges were yellowed with age. Emily stared at the handwriting on the front. It was her mother's, in careful cursive, for Emily, and only when she is ready. Her throat tightened. What's inside? She whispered. Mr. Whitaker shook his head. I promised your mother I wouldn't read it. Jacob rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. It's probably sentimental nonsense. William stood. Emily, listen. His voice softened. Too softened. The inn's worthless. We can help you sell it. Jacob nodded eagerly. Honestly, you'll be miserable out there. No electricity half the time. No neighbors. Nothing. Emily looked at her brothers. For the first time in her life, she saw them clearly. Not as the boys who used to tease her. Not as the men their father admired. Just two people terrified of receiving less. And strangely, that made her less afraid. Mr. Whitaker handed her another document. The ferry leaves every Wednesday and Saturday. Emily blinked. You think I should go? The old man smiled sadly. I think. He paused. I think your mother spent many years hoping you would. That night, Emily packed everything she owned into one suitcase. 3 sweaters, a pair of boots, her mother's cardigan, and the unopened envelope. William didn't come downstairs. Jacob shouted a quick goodbye from the kitchen. Neither offered to drive her. As the taxi pulled away from the house she'd grown up in, Emily looked back one last time. The porch light glowed softly. Her bedroom window faced the ocean. For a moment, she imagined her parents standing there, watching, waiting. Then the house disappeared behind the trees. Emily lowered her head and cried quietly. She wasn't just leaving a place. She was leaving the last version of herself. The girl who begged to be chosen. The girl who believed love had to be earned. She didn't know what waited for her on Whispering Isle, only that she had nowhere else to go. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief, beneath the fear, a tiny part of her wondered, why would her mother leave her a place everyone else had forgotten? The answer was waiting beyond the fog, and it was bigger than Emily could ever imagine. The ferry to Whispering Isle left just after sunrise. Emily sat alone near the back, her suitcase resting beside her feet, her mother's cardigan wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The sea was rough that morning. Gray waves crashed against the hull, sending cold spray into the air. Most passengers stayed inside the cabin, but Emily remained outside. She needed the wind, needed something stronger than grief to remind her she was still alive. As the mainland slowly disappeared behind layers of fog, she wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. An abandoned inn, on a forgotten island. That was all she had. No family, no home, no plan. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it made her feel strangely free. By noon, the captain pointed ahead. "There," he said. Emily stood. At first, she saw nothing but fog. Then slowly, a dark shape emerged. Whispering Isle. The island looked like something out of an old story. Jagged cliffs, twisted pine trees, a tiny harbor with weathered docks, and beyond them, perched on a hill overlooking the sea, stood Silver Moon Inn. Emily forgot to breathe. It was enormous. Far bigger than she had imagined. 3 stories tall. White once, though time and storms had stained the walls gray. The roof sagged in places. Several windows were boarded shut. Others stared back at her like empty eyes. It looked lonely. The kind of lonely that settles into a place after decades without laughter. The ferry docked. Emily stepped onto the pier. The air smelled of salt and pine. No one greeted her. No taxis. No shops. Just silence. A wooden sign near the harbor read, "Population 27. Emily stared at the number. 27 people. That was all. She pulled her suitcase behind her and began walking uphill. The road was cracked and overgrown. Old houses lined the path. Most were abandoned. Some had curtains fluttering inside broken windows. Others had gardens swallowed by weeds. Everywhere she looked, she saw reminders of lives that used to be. A bicycle rusting beside a fence. A porch swing moving gently in the wind. A mailbox overflowing with yellowed newspapers. The island felt frozen in time. And somehow, so did Emily. By the time she reached the inn, her legs ached. She stopped at the foot of the stairs. Silver Moon Inn towered above her. The faded sign still hung above the entrance. The moon painted on it had nearly disappeared. Emily climbed the steps slowly. The front door groaned when she pushed it open. The smell hit her first. Dust, old wood, sea air, and something else. Lavender. Emily frowned. Impossible. She stepped inside. The lobby was vast. Sunlight streamed through cracked windows. Dust danced in the air. An old piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. A chandelier hung crookedly from the ceiling, and directly ahead, behind the reception desk, stood a grandfather clock. It had stopped at exactly 9:17. Emily walked closer. The hands wouldn't move. The pendulum was frozen. She touched the glass gently. Cold. For some reason, it made her sad, like someone had been waiting for time to start again. She spent the afternoon exploring. The kitchen was abandoned. The dining room covered in sheets. There were 20 guest rooms upstairs. Some still had neatly made beds. Others looked as if people had left in a hurry. In room 12, she found a teddy bear sitting upright on a pillow. In room 7, a pair of reading glasses rested beside an open book. Everywhere. Life interrupted. She couldn't explain why. But the inn didn't feel abandoned. It felt patient, as if it had been waiting for something, or someone. That night, Emily lit a lantern she found in the pantry. The electricity flickered but refused to stay on. Rain tapped softly against the windows. She sat alone in the lobby eating crackers from her backpack. The silence felt enormous. She thought about William, Jacob, the house she'd never see again. For a moment, anger rose inside her, then sadness, then exhaustion. Emily curled up on an old sofa near the fireplace and cried. Not because the inn was falling apart, not because she was afraid, but because she finally admitted the truth. No one was coming for her, not her brothers, not some miracle, not even the version of herself she used to be. She was alone, and she would have to learn how to survive. Eventually, her tears stopped. She wiped her face and looked around the dark lobby. That's when she noticed it. A photograph hanging above the fireplace. She hadn't seen it before. Emily stood. The frame was dusty. Inside was a black and white picture. A woman stood in front of the inn, elegant, strong, with kind eyes. Emily stared. The woman looked familiar, very familiar. Then she realized why. She had her mother's smile. Beneath the picture was a brass plaque. Margaret Dawson, 1928 to 1998. Emily's heart skipped. Her grandmother. She had only seen her in photographs as a child, but never here, never at the inn. Her mother had barely spoken about Margaret. Why? Emily lifted the frame from the wall. Something rattled behind it. A small key fell onto the floor. Emily stared. Attached to the key was a faded paper tag. In her mother's handwriting were 4 words. For when you're ready. Her breath caught. Suddenly she remembered the envelope. The one she still hadn't opened. Hands trembling, she rushed upstairs. Back to the room she'd chosen. She pulled the envelope from her suitcase. Carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Only one sentence. Written in her mother's careful cursive. The answers you're looking for are beneath the clock. Emily frowned. Beneath the clock. She looked toward the lobby below. The old grandfather clock. Still frozen. Still standing at 9:17. Thunder rumbled outside. The wind howled through the inn. And for the first time since arriving, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in days. Not grief. Not loneliness. Curiosity. Because suddenly, the abandoned inn didn't feel abandoned at all. It felt alive, and somewhere beneath its creaking floors, a secret had been waiting for more than 60 years. Waiting. For her, for a long time, Emily simply stood there. The note trembled slightly in her hands. The answers you're looking for beneath the clock. Outside, rain battered the windows of Silver Moon Inn. Wind rattled the old glass panes, sending faint whistles through the hallways. But Emily barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the grandfather clock below, the same clock she had touched earlier, the same clock frozen at exactly 9:17. Suddenly, that time didn't feel random anymore. Nothing about this place felt random. She grabbed the lantern and hurried downstairs. The lobby seemed different now, less abandoned, less forgotten, almost as if the inn had been waiting for her to understand something. The grandfather clock stood silently near the reception desk. Emily knelt beside it. Years of dust coated the base. She ran her fingers along the wooden frame. At first, she found nothing. Then she noticed scratches near the floorboards. Not damage, marks, like something had been moved countless times. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she pushed against the base. Nothing. She pushed harder. The wood shifted slightly. Emily froze, then pushed again. This time, a section of the floor beneath the clock slid sideways with a low grinding sound. A hidden compartment. She stared at it. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Who builds a secret compartment beneath a clock? And, more importantly, why? The opening revealed a narrow staircase disappearing into darkness. Cold air drifted upward. Air that smelled of old paper and cedar wood. Emily swallowed. Every sensible part of her mind told her not to go down there alone. But another part? The part that had spent years caring for dying parents. The part that had crossed an ocean of grief just to survive. Refused to turn back. She lifted the lantern and descended. The staircase seemed endless. Each step creaked softly beneath her feet. The deeper she went, the quieter the storm above became. Until finally, she reached the bottom. Emily raised the lantern and gasped. The room was enormous, far larger than the inn above should have allowed. Shelves lined every wall. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of boxes, neatly labeled, perfectly preserved, not hidden treasure, not gold, not cash, boxes, and books, rows upon rows of books. Emily stepped closer. The nearest box had a handwritten label, Thomas Green, 1964. Another, Margaret Ellis, 1978. Another, Daniel Brooks, 1989. Names. Dozens of names. Hundreds. She opened one carefully. Inside were letters, photographs, medical documents, journal entries, newspaper clippings. The complete story of someone's life. Confused, Emily opened another, and another. Soon a pattern emerged. Every box belonged to someone who had once stayed at Silver Moon Inn. People from all over America. Widows, veterans, single mothers, former addicts, bankrupt business owners. People who had lost everything. People who had nowhere else to go. Emily sat on the floor, her lantern casting long shadows around the room, and she began to read. Hours passed. She barely noticed. One letter came from a Vietnam veteran. Another from a woman whose husband had died unexpectedly. A third from a man who had spent 6 months sleeping in his car before arriving on the island. Again and again, the stories ended the same way. Not with money, not with success, but with gratitude. Every letter thanked one person, Margaret Dawson, Emily's grandmother. Tears filled her eyes. The stories were heartbreaking, but they were also beautiful. People wrote about arriving broken, lost, alone, and somehow finding hope again inside the walls of Silver Moon Inn. One letter stopped her completely. The paper was yellow with age, the handwriting shaky. It read, "When I arrived at the inn, I had already decided to end my life. Margaret sat with me every evening for 3 weeks. She never judged me, never lectured me. She just listened. 30 years later, I have grandchildren because she refused to give up on me. Emily covered her mouth. A sob escaped before she could stop it. Her grandmother hadn't run a business. She had built a refuge, a place for people who had nowhere else to go, a place for people the world had forgotten, just like Whispering Isle itself, just like Emily. For years, she had believed her brothers were the successful ones, William with his company, Jacob with his investments, and maybe they were. But sitting there among those letters, Emily began to understand something. Success wasn't always measured by what you accumulated. Sometimes it was measured by how many people stood because you helped them rise. Near midnight, she discovered a leather journal resting alone on a wooden desk. Margaret Dawson. Written across the cover, Emily's heart pounded. She opened it carefully. The first pages described life at the inn, the guests, the island, the storms. Then she reached an entry dated 30 years earlier, and everything changed. The words were written in bold ink, as if Margaret wanted them noticed. One day, this place will belong to someone in our family, not the smartest, not the richest, not the strongest. It must belong to the one who understands why it exists. Emily blinked. Her eyes filled again. She turned the page. More entries. More years. Then a final note. Short. Simple. Written just months before Margaret died. If Emily ever finds this room. Emily froze. Her breath caught. The lantern flickered beside her. Slowly. She continued reading. If Emily ever finds this room, then she has already survived the hardest part. She will think she has been abandoned. She will think she has lost everything. Tell her she is wrong. Tears rolled down Emily's cheeks. She could barely see the page. The final sentence was underlined twice. The inn was never our family's greatest asset. The people were. For a long time, Emily sat in silence, listening, not to the storm, not to the wind, but to something shifting inside her. For days, she had believed her parents left her the smallest inheritance, a ruined inn, a forgotten island, a life nobody wanted. Now she wasn't so sure, because hidden beneath the floorboards wasn't wealth. It was purpose. And for the first time since her parents died, Emily no longer felt abandoned. She felt chosen, not by chance, not by luck, but by generations of people who believed kindness mattered more than money. Above her, Silver Moon, ingrown softly as another wave of wind hit the island. The sound no longer felt lonely. It felt alive, and somewhere deep inside, a young woman who had arrived believing her story was ending, began to realize it might finally be starting. Emily didn't sleep much that night. How could she? She sat at the old desk in the hidden room until dawn, surrounded by letters from strangers who no longer felt like strangers at all. People who had arrived broken. People who had walked into Silver Moon Inn carrying grief, fear, loneliness, and regret, and somehow they had left with hope. The more she read, the more one question echoed in her mind. Why had her parents never told her? Why keep something this important hidden? As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the dusty windows above, Emily finally climbed back up the staircase. The inn felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because she had. For the first time since arriving on the island, she didn't see decay. She saw potential. The peeling wallpaper wasn't damage. It was history. The empty guest rooms weren't abandoned. They were waiting. The silence wasn't loneliness. It was possibility. Emily walked slowly through the lobby. The grandfather clock still stood at 9:17, but now she understood. Time hadn't stopped here. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to begin again. She smiled for the first time in weeks. A real smile, the kind that comes from somewhere deep inside. Then she looked around the enormous lobby and immediately laughed. The place was still a disaster. Dust covered everything. Half the furniture was broken. The roof leaked. The kitchen barely functioned. And she had less than $3,000 left to her name. Reality had a way of arriving quickly. Still, something inside her refused to give up. That morning, she found a notebook and wrote 3 simple words on the first page. Save the inn. No business plan. No strategy. Just 3 words. For now, that was enough. Over the next few days, Emily worked harder than she ever had. She cleaned room after room, dragged out broken furniture, swept decades of dust from the hallways. At night, her hands ached. Her shoulders burned. Sometimes she cried from exhaustion, but every morning she started again, because every time she felt like quitting, she remembered the letters. The veteran, the widow, the young man who almost gave up on life, and Margaret, especially Margaret. One afternoon, while cleaning the reception desk, Emily discovered an old guest ledger. The pages stretched back decades. Names from every corner of America. New York, Texas, California, Florida. Many entries included notes written in Margaret's handwriting. Needs encouragement. Recently lost husband. Wonderful singer. Remind her of that. Very lonely. Check on him tomorrow. Emily wiped away tears. Margaret hadn't simply housed people. She had seen them. Really seen them. The way most people never do. That realization stayed with Emily. And slowly, an idea began to form. 3 days later, she borrowed an old camera from one of the island's residents, a retired fisherman named Walter. He was 76 years old and lived near the harbor. Nobody's touched that inn in 20 years, he told her. You sure you're up for this? Emily looked toward the hill, toward Silver Moon Inn. No, she admitted honestly. Walter laughed. Good answer. Then he handed her the camera. That evening, Emily recorded a short video. Nothing fancy. No music. No editing. Just her standing in the lobby. Dust floating through beams of sunlight. Her hair pulled back. Her face tired. Honest. My name is Emily Dawson, she said. A few weeks ago, I lost both of my parents. She paused. The words still hurt, then continued. I inherited this abandoned inn on a forgotten island. She glanced around. It probably looks hopeless. A small smile crossed her face. Some days it feels hopeless, too. She held up one of Margaret's letters. But I've discovered something incredible here. She looked directly into the camera. This place once helped people rebuild their lives. And maybe... Her voice softened. Maybe it can do that again. That was all. 3 minutes. No dramatic speech. No sales pitch. Just truth. Emily uploaded the video using the inn's painfully slow internet connection. Then she forgot about it. Or tried to. The next morning, she was painting a guest room when her phone started vibrating. Once, twice, then nonstop. Emily frowned. She almost never received messages. Confused, she opened her email. Hundreds. By lunchtime, there were thousands. She stared in disbelief. Messages from strangers. People sharing stories. People talking about grief. About losing spouses. Parents. Children. Many simply wrote, "Thank you." Others asked how they could help. One message came from Arizona. I stayed at Silver Moon Inn in 1982 with my mother. Another arrived from Ohio. Margaret saved my father's life, then one from Chicago. I thought everyone had forgotten places like this. Emily sat at the reception desk reading message after message. Crying, laughing, crying again. For the first time since her parents died, she didn't feel alone. The world was larger than her grief. And somehow, it had found her. A week later, the first donation arrived, $50. Then another, then $25. Then $500. Most came from ordinary people. Retirees, teachers, veterans, widows. People who simply believed the inn deserved another chance, just like they once had. Then, something even more surprising happened. The phone rang. The old phone mounted behind the reception desk. Emily nearly jumped. It hadn't worked since she arrived. At least she thought it hadn't. The ringing echoed through the empty lobby. Slowly, she picked it up. Silver Moon Inn, she answered nervously. A gentle voice replied. Hello? There was a pause. Then, my name is Eleanor Parker. The woman sounded elderly. I stayed there with my husband 43 years ago. Emily's eyes widened. The woman continued softly. He passed away last spring. Silence filled the line. Then Eleanor whispered, I was wondering. Her voice trembled. Do you think I could come back? Emily looked around the empty lobby. The dusty furniture, the unfinished walls, the peeling paint. Then she smiled. A tear slipped down her cheek. Yes, she said, you can come home. After hanging up, Emily stood alone in the lobby. The sunlight streamed through the windows. The ocean sparkled beyond the cliffs. For the first time, she could see the future. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. Because Silver Moon Inn wasn't just an inheritance anymore. It was becoming something else. A second chance, not only for the people who would arrive seeking healing, but for Emily herself. And though she didn't know it yet, the greatest challenges were still ahead. Because on the mainland, William and Jacob had started asking questions. Questions about the island. Questions about the inn. Questions about why strangers were suddenly talking about a place everyone had forgotten. And questions have a way of uncovering trouble. Winter arrived quietly on Whispering Isle. One morning, Emily opened the front door and found the world covered in silver frost. The pine trees sparkled beneath the rising sun, and the ocean beyond the cliffs looked like hammered steel. Just a few months earlier, the sight would have made her feel isolated. Now it felt like home, not because the island had changed, because she had. The old Emily would have been terrified. Terrified of being alone. Terrified of failing. Terrified of making the wrong choice. But somewhere between the letters in the hidden room and the strangers who had begun finding their way back to Silver Moon Inn, something inside her had started to heal. She still missed her parents every day. That would never change. But grief no longer felt like a storm trying to drown her. It felt more like the tide, always present, always moving. Part of her now. The inn slowly came back to life. Not all at once, and not in some dramatic, movie-like transformation. It happened quietly. One room at a time. One guest at a time. One story at a time. Eleanor Parker became the first official guest. When the 78-year-old widow stepped off the ferry, Emily recognized her immediately. Not because she had ever met her, but because she carried the same sadness Emily had seen in hundreds of Margaret's letters. The sadness of someone learning how to live after losing the person they loved most. Emily helped carry her suitcase. The old woman looked around the inn and smiled softly. "It smells exactly the same." Emily laughed. "Dust and seawater." Eleanor smiled. "And hope." That night, they sat beside the fireplace together. Eleanor spoke about her husband. 49 years of marriage. Road trips. Arguments. Birthdays. Ordinary moments. The kind people never realize are extraordinary until they're gone. Emily listened for hours, just as Margaret once had, and for the first time, she understood why her grandmother had devoted her life to this place. People don't always need advice. Sometimes they simply need someone willing to listen. Over the following weeks, more guests arrived. A retired teacher from Vermont, a former firefighter from Pennsylvania, a woman who had spent 2 years caring for her husband through Alzheimer's. Each person carried invisible scars. Each arrived believing they were alone, and each discovered they weren't. Something remarkable began happening inside the walls of Silver Moon Inn. People started talking. Not the polite conversations strangers usually have. Real conversations. The kind that only happen when people feel safe enough to tell the truth. They shared stories over breakfast, laughed around the fireplace, cried on the porch overlooking the sea. Slowly, the inn became what it had once been. A refuge, a place where broken hearts could rest. And Emily, without realizing it, became the heart of it. One evening, she found herself standing before the old mirror in the lobby. For a moment, she barely recognized the reflection. The woman staring back looked different, stronger. Not because life had become easier, because she had survived things she once thought would destroy her. She remembered the girl who sat crying in her mother's bedroom, the girl who believed she had been left with nothing. That girl was still part of her, but she was no longer the whole story. A few days before Christmas, Walter stopped by the inn. The old fisherman carried a box of fresh-baked cookies from his daughter. He watched the guests laughing around the fireplace. Then he turned to Emily. "You know what the funny thing is?" "What?" Walter smiled. "This place hasn't changed." Emily frowned. "It looks pretty different to me." Walter shook his head. "No." He glanced around the room. "The walls are the same. The fireplace is the same. The ocean's still out there." He looked directly at her. "The thing that changed was you." The words stayed with her long after he left, because he was right. The miracle wasn't the inn. The miracle was what had happened inside her. For most of her life, Emily had measured her worth through other people, through approval, through sacrifice, through being needed. But now, for the first time, she understood something important. Her value had never depended on anyone choosing her. Not her brothers, not her parents, not the world. She mattered because she existed. As simple as that. The realization brought a kind of peace she had never known. Not happiness. Something deeper. Acceptance. Then, just after New Year's, trouble arrived. It came in the form of a certified letter. Emily found it in the mailbox near the harbor. The return address made her stomach tighten immediately. William Dawson. She opened it slowly. The letter was formal. Cold. Written by attorneys. There were questions regarding the property. Questions regarding ownership. Questions regarding records discovered on the island. William requested a review of all historical assets connected to Silver Moon Inn. Emily read the letter twice, then a third time. A few months earlier, she would have panicked. A few months earlier, she would have cried. A few months earlier, she might even have surrendered. Instead, she folded the letter carefully, placed it in her coat pocket, and continued walking home. Because something fundamental had changed. She was no longer the frightened young woman waiting for someone else to decide her future. She had crossed an ocean of grief, built a life from ruins, created something beautiful where others saw nothing of value. For the first time in her life, she trusted herself. That evening, after the guests had gone to bed, Emily sat alone beside the grandfather clock. The same clock that had led her to Margaret's hidden room. The same clock frozen at 9:17. She opened Margaret's journal again. A folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages. Emily unfolded it carefully. Only one sentence was written there. A sentence Margaret had underlined twice. The people who chase money inherit possessions. The people who serve others inherit purpose. Emily read the words again and again. Then she smiled. Outside, snow fell softly across Whispering Isle. Inside, the fire crackled gently. For the first time in years, Emily felt exactly where she was supposed to be. What she didn't know was that William and Jacob were already making plans. Plans that would bring them to the island. Plans that would threaten everything she had built. And soon, Emily would be forced to fight for the legacy her family had entrusted to her. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with the one thing her brothers had never understood, the power of a life devoted to others. By the time spring arrived, Silver Moon Inn was no longer forgotten. The ferry that once carried only a handful of passengers now arrived with visitors almost every week. Some came because they had heard the stories. Others came because they were searching for something they couldn't quite name. Peace, purpose, a place to breathe again. And somehow they found it here. The inn wasn't luxurious. The furniture didn't match. The floors still creaked, and the ocean winds still rattled the windows on stormy nights. But people loved it, because Silver Moon Inn offered something most places couldn't. It made people feel seen. Emily often stood in the lobby watching guests talk around the fireplace. Strangers arrived carrying burdens. They left carrying hope, and every time she witnessed it, she thought of Margaret, of her parents, of the hidden room beneath the clock. She finally understood. The inn had never been about the building. It was about what happened inside it. And one morning, everything changed. A black SUV rolled off the ferry. Two men stepped onto the dock. William and Jacob. Emily saw them from the porch. For a moment, old emotions stirred inside her. Pain, disappointment, memories of being overlooked. But something surprised her. Anger never came, because she wasn't the same person anymore. The brothers walked slowly toward the inn. Neither spoke. They simply stared. The flower gardens were blooming. Guests sat on rocking chairs overlooking the sea. Laughter drifted from the dining room. The place they had dismissed as worthless had become alive again. Jacob looked around in disbelief. This is impossible. William remained silent. His eyes moved from the restored building to the guests gathered outside. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on his face. Inside the inn, Emily greeted them calmly. Neither brother hugged her. Neither apologized. Instead, William placed a folder on the reception desk. Legal documents. Emily wasn't surprised. She had expected this day. "We need to discuss ownership rights," William said. "The family deserves transparency." Family. The word sounded strange coming from him. Emily glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. "What exactly do you think you'll find?" she asked quietly. Jacob crossed his arms. "We know Mom and Dad were hiding something. The island. The records. The secret room." His voice sharpened. "People don't fight this hard over an old inn." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Emily smiled softly. A sad smile. the kind reserved for people who still couldn't see what was right in front of them. "You still think this was about money?" William's jaw tightened. Neither brother answered, because the truth was obvious. They had spent months chasing a treasure that didn't exist. The real treasure was all around them, and they couldn't recognize it. A week later, the dispute reached court. The hearing drew attention from local newspapers, not because of wealth, but because of the unusual story surrounding Silver Moon Inn. The courtroom was packed. Emily sat quietly beside her attorney. Across the room sat William and Jacob, confident, certain, still convinced they had been denied something valuable. Then the judge asked a simple question. Why was this property left exclusively to Emily Dawson? Silence filled the room. Emily slowly stood. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from emotion. She carried a small wooden box, the same box she had discovered in Margaret's hidden room only days earlier. Inside was a final letter, one her mother had written shortly before she died. Emily unfolded it carefully, then began to read. Her mother's words filled the courtroom. Soft, gentle, powerful. If this letter is being read, then Emily has finally found what we hoped she would. Emily's voice faltered. She continued, Our sons have many gifts. They understand business. They understand investments. They understand how to build wealth. A long pause followed. Then Emily read the next line. But Emily understands people. The courtroom grew silent. Even William lowered his eyes. Emily kept reading. For years, she cared for us without asking for anything in return. She stayed when others were busy. She listened when we were afraid. She gave us dignity when illness took everything else. Tears appeared in the eyes of several people sitting in the gallery. Emily felt her own vision blur. Then she reached the final paragraph. The paragraph her mother had underlined twice. Our sons will inherit what we built. Emily will inherit why we built it. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence seemed to stretch forever. Then something remarkable happened. An elderly man slowly stood from the back row. Emily recognized him immediately. A veteran who had stayed at the inn months earlier. Then another person stood. And another. And another. Soon, nearly 20 people were on their feet. Former guests. People whose lives had been touched by Silver Moon Inn. A widow. A retired teacher. A cancer survivor. A former firefighter. Each one carried a story. Each one had come voluntarily. Not for Emily. Not for the court. But to honor the legacy that had changed their lives. The judge listened as one after another shared their experiences. How the inn had given them hope. How Emily had listened. How she had helped them find their way forward. By the end, many people in the room were crying, including Jacob. He wiped his eyes quickly, hoping nobody noticed. But Emily saw, for the first time, he wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about what he had missed. The judge's decision came quickly. Ownership would remain entirely with Emily. The matter was settled, legally, finally, but the most important moment happened afterward. Outside the courthouse, William approached his sister alone. The spring wind moved through the trees. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then William said something Emily never expected to hear. I was wrong. Just 4 words. Simple. Honest. Years overdue. Emily looked at her older brother, the man she had spent her life trying to impress, and suddenly realized she didn't need his approval anymore. Not because she hated him, because she had finally found her own worth. William's eyes filled with regret. We thought they trusted us more. Emily shook her head gently. No. She looked toward the ocean in the distance. I think they trusted us differently. For the first time, William understood, and for the first time, Emily felt completely free. The battle was over. The inn was safe, and the legacy her family had protected for generations would continue. Not because of wealth, not because of ownership, but because one young woman had chosen compassion over bitterness, and in doing so, had become exactly the person her parents always knew she could be. Years passed. The storms still came to Whispering Isle. The ocean still pounded against the cliffs every winter. And every evening, just before sunset, the warm lights of Silver Moon Inn glowed across the water, like a lighthouse, not for ships, for people who arrived carrying grief, loneliness, regret, and sometimes nothing more than the hope that tomorrow might hurt a little less than today. Emily never became rich, at least not in the way William and Jacob once measured wealth. She never owned a company, never appeared on television, never built an empire. But year after year, the guest book at Silver Moon Inn filled with names, and beside those names, stories. Stories of second chances, stories of healing, stories of lives that had almost been lost. One autumn evening, many years later, Emily was locking the front door when she noticed a young girl standing on the porch, maybe 10 years old. The child held a small envelope in both hands. "Can I help you?" Emily asked gently. The girl nodded. "My grandmother asked me to bring this." Emily smiled. "Who's your grandmother?" The little girl pointed toward a silver sedan parked near the road. An elderly woman sat inside. Her white hair glowed in the fading sunlight. Emily didn't recognize her, but somehow the woman seemed familiar. The girl handed over the envelope. Then she said something that made Emily's heart stop. "My grandma stayed here a long time ago. She said this place saved her life." The child smiled. "She talks about it all the time." Then she ran back toward the car. Emily stood alone on the porch. The envelope suddenly felt heavy in her hands. Slowly, she opened it. Inside was a photograph. An old photograph, faded around the edges. It showed a much younger woman standing beside Margaret Dawson in front of Silver Moon Inn. Both were laughing. Both looked happy. Tucked behind the picture was a handwritten note. Only one sentence. Emily read it once, then again, and again. Tears filled her eyes. The note said, "Thank you for keeping the light on." Emily lowered her head. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Not because she was sad, because she finally understood all those years ago, when she left her childhood home carrying a single suitcase. She thought her parents had abandoned her. She thought they had given everything valuable to her brothers. She thought she was receiving whatever nobody else wanted. But standing there on the porch, holding that photograph, she saw the truth. William and Jacob inherited what her parents owned. She inherited what they believed. And somehow, that turned out to be worth more. The front door creaked softly behind her. Guests laughed somewhere inside the inn. The smell of coffee drifted through the hallway. Life. Simple, ordinary, beautiful life. Emily looked up toward the fireplace visible through the lobby windows. 3 photographs hung there now. Margaret Dawson, her mother, her father. 3 generations, one purpose. For a long moment, she stood in silence. Then she whispered the words she wished she could have said years earlier. "Now I understand." The wind carried her voice toward the sea, and somehow she imagined her parents hearing it, not as a goodbye, but as an answer, the answer they had been waiting for all along. The lights of Silver Moon Inn shone warmly against the darkening sky, a beacon for anyone searching for their way home. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes the inheritance that changes your life isn't money. It isn't property. It isn't success. Sometimes it's a purpose, a responsibility, a chance to become the person you were always meant to be. Because in the end, people won't remember what you owned. They'll remember how you made them feel. And long after we're gone, the kindness we leave behind becomes the light that stays on for someone else forever.